And now, a passage from Americans in Eastern Asia by Tyler Dennett, from Chapter 31, Hawaii and the Philippines. The Philippines in the Spanish-American War. No relation whatever can be established between the outbreak of hostilities with Spain and the Far Eastern question, except that there was a concurrence of dates in the disturbed conditions in China and the climax of the often recurring disturbances in Cuba, and that both synchronized with the expansive movement in American trade which had followed the recovery from the panic of 1893. The Sino-Japanese War had caused a very notable strengthening of continental fleets in Chinese waters. Notwithstanding the warnings of naval officers frequently offered in the last quarter of a century, the Americans were without a naval base in the Far East. Therefore, at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, the American fleet in the Far East was left by the declarations of neutrality of Japan, China, and Great Britain in a position which required either a retirement of the fleet to Honolulu, from which a declaration of neutrality by the Hawaiian Republic might have barred it, or an attack upon Manila. The retirement of the American forces from the Far East in the spring of 1898, when the Chinese Empire was in such precarious condition, would have resulted in a very great loss of American prestige, and perhaps an attack upon American life and property, for the Chinese had always been quick to interpret such events as an involuntary weakening of a foreign power. American shipping also would have been exposed to attack from the Spanish fleet at Manila. The attack upon Manila by the American forces was not, however, accidental or unforeseen. Commodore George Dewey was ordered to Japan October 21st, 1897, to assume command of the Far Eastern Squadron. 10 days after the destruction of the USS Maine at Havana Harbor, Dewey was instructed to hold himself in readiness to engage the Spanish squadron at Manila and to conduct offensive operations against the Philippines. The intent of these orders, however, appears plainly to have been to remove the menace of the Spanish fleet rather than to acquire Manila. The American fleet was ordered to rendezvous at Hong Kong, and measures were immediately taken to secure adequate supplies. Dewey was even prepared to ignore any declaration of neutrality which might be made by the Chinese Empire. He was informed that Japan, which at that time was badly frightened by the presence of such large European forces in the East, would maintain the most scrupulous neutrality, a neutrality which, nevertheless, Japan was induced to relax slightly a few months after the war broke out. Upon the announcement that a state of hostilities existed between the United States and Spain, there was no declaration of war by either side. The British representatives at Hong Kong requested the American fleet to leave by 4 p.m. April 25th. Commodore Dewey complied, and with no unnecessary delay, proceeded to Manila Bay. The Battle of May 1st, with its swift and brilliant victory, left Dewey in control of the bay with the city in his power. Owing to the lack of a sufficient landing force, Dewey refrained from occupying the city, which he would have been unable to police. Manila was not taken until August 13th, and then after some little resistance, which probably would not have been presented had the Americans been prepared on May 1st to reap the fruits of their naval victory. Two concurrent events, significant in a study of policy, demand attention. There had been incipient or open rebellion in the Philippines for more than a decade. The execution by the Spanish authorities of Dr. José Rizal, the Filipino patriot, December 30th, 1896, had produced a short-lived insurrection which was suspended early in 1897 by the arrival of Spanish reinforcements and the agreement of the rebel leaders Andres Bonifacio and Emilio Aguinaldo, upon the payment of several $100,000 to retire from the island. These men went to Hong Kong and established a Filipino junta with the money thus obtained and were able to continue their patriotic agitation. This junta formally sought the intervention and protection of the United States and later proposed an alliance. The insurgents had previously sought the aid of Japan. Early in 1898, there were insurrections in both Luzon and Cebu. In April 1898, Commodore Dewey had several conferences with the Filipino leaders at Hong Kong, and in the latter part of the month, E. Spencer Pratt, United States Consul General at Singapore, had an interview with Aguinaldo, recently arrived from Hong Kong, and appears to have proposed to him that he return to China, join Dewey's forces, and accompany the Americans to Manila with a view to assisting them in the Philippines, just as Gomez and Garcia had been helping the American forces in Cuba by promoting insurrection against the Spanish authority. Dewey approved of the suggestion, and May 19th, Aguinaldo was brought to Manila in the U.S. dispatch boat McCulloch upon Dewey's order. While Dewey was careful to make no promises to Aguinaldo, he did give no little encouragement and turned over to him the arsenal at Cavite and permitted him to organize his insurgent forces within the American lines. Consul General Roncesvalles Wildman had also assisted the insurrectos to purchase arms in Hong Kong. Aguinaldo gave out the statement to the Filipinos that the United States would assist the insurrectors. It does not appear that Admiral Dewey or any of the American representatives in contact with the insurgents before the arrival of the 1st Expeditionary Forces June 30th had any suspicion that the United States would acquire the Philippines. Every American citizen who came in contact with the Filipinos at the inception of the Spanish War, stated General Thomas M. Anderson, who was the first to give to Dewey the news that there was talk in the United States of the retention of the islands, or at any time within a few months after hostilities began, probably told those he talked with that we intended to free them from Spanish oppression. In other words, Consul General Pratt, Admiral Dewey, and many more were reaffirming what had been stated hundreds of times by American representatives in the East since the days in 1832, when Edmund Roberts made his treaties vis-a-vis that the United States had neither the intention nor the constitutional right to acquire colonies. In support of this opinion, there was also the very recent declaration of President McKinley at the outbreak of the war that the acquisition of territory was not the purpose of the United States. The Filipino insurgents appear, however, to have considered the possibility that the American government might alter its traditional policy, and to have decided that at any rate it would be well to accept such aid as was being immediately offered and to meet future problems as they arose. Aguinaldo organized a government on June 12th, proclaimed a provisional constitution June 23rd, and on August 6th, a week before the American forces occupied Manila, issued an appeal to the nations of the world for recognition of the independence and belligerency of his government. Meanwhile, the insurrectos established military control over part of Luzon. The second significant event of this period was the action of the 3 European powers which only 3 years before had intervened to demand the recession of the Liaotung Peninsula to China and subsequently forced the empire to lease the various ports already referred to as well as to grant the spheres of influence. Germany, especially, had revealed an alarming land hunger and was known to be intriguing in Europe to bring about intervention in the Spanish-American War. At Hong Kong, Prince Henry, the Kaiser's brother, who had been dispatched to China to make sure of the lease of Kiaochou, remarked to Dewey that he did not believe that the European powers would permit the United States to retain Cuba. Shortly after May 1st, 2 German cruisers appeared at Manila, and other German war vessels followed. Indeed, a transport with 1,200 reserves was anchored in the harbor for a month. Vice Admiral von Dietrichs stated to Dewey, rather sharply, "I am here by order of the Kaiser, sir," and proceeded to show a notable indifference to the blockade regulations which Dewey had established. The German force at the end of June was larger than the blockading squadron. At the same time, the Germans sustained very intimate relations with the Spanish authorities within the uncaptured city and made themselves familiar with the military situation. President McKinley is reported to have believed that war with Germany was imminent. Meanwhile, the ranking officer of the British naval vessels, Admiral Chichester, also observing the proceedings upon orders from his government, fully sustained Dewey's blockade regulations, and on August 13th, when the American fleet proceeded to attack the city in cooperation with the American land forces, the British admiral moved HMS Immortalite to a point which placed it between the American fleet and the vessels of the European powers. Upon receiving notice that the city had surrendered to the Americans, the British vessel alone offered a salute to the American flag.